personal views and opinions expressed by our podcast guests are their own and are not legal advice or official statements by their organizations. Hello, my name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. This is the Data Diva Talks Privacy podcast, where we discuss data privacy issues with industry leaders around the world with information that businesses need to know now. I have a special guest on the show, Tharishni Arumugam. She is the head of the Global Privacy Technology and Operations Director at Aon, and she is in the United Kingdom. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for inviting me. I'm really excited to be on the famous Data Diva podcast.
Yeah, this is great. So I always like to start the show with sort of how we met. We were put together on a panel for PrivSec London. And so we were able to meet in person and do this panel, and it was very well attended. And it was great to actually be there with you and talk with you. One of the things that really struck me about kind of our prep and my time meeting you in person is that you have like a very, sparky personality. You're able to really relate these concepts in very simple ways to people. And I think, you just have a lot of energy and a lot of passion, obviously, for privacy. But I would love for you to introduce yourself and tell me about kind of your trajectory, your journey in privacy.
Sure. And thank you. Such kind words. So I started out in privacy in Malaysia, the land far, far away. And it was a really new concept. So we don't have the concept of privacy so much as data protection in Malaysia. And when I started as an apprentice in a law firm, in order to be a rail lawyer, I kind of got bored of your traditional litigation or arbitration, because I was kind of doing arbitration for a bit, going to court and arguing about construction points or in a mediation room did not excite me. Tax law did not excite me. And so they said, look, like we really need a junior person to do this new thing that's coming up. We've got lots of clients having demand for, understanding what the law means, understanding what they need to do to comply. And so that's how I started out doing data protection, is because I did this other stuff and I was like, not for me. And I was really close to leaving the law, honestly, before I found data protection and privacy, which was, just serendipitous. And then I got hired by my current company and got moved to Singapore, where I got a more regional view of data protection and privacy. And that was, a really fun 4.5 years, because it was really new in Asia Pac. Everyone who had responsibility over privacy in the scene in Singapore, we all connected, we all knew each other, we shared knowledge. And there's this Asia DPO community back in Singapore that still is very strong now. And somehow it's just become something that I've really been passionate about. I love what I do because it's so relatable. It's that part of the law that is so easily applicable to what you do on a daily basis, unless you're a hermit and you shut yourself off from technology. Privacy law affects your life, I think, in more ways than you would imagine. And then, I wouldn't say that I have a technology background, but I like understanding things and breaking things down. And so every time someone talks about a piece of data and analytics or technology, I like breaking it down for myself, which I find then helpful for other people to understand as well, how certain things work and what are the legal implications around it, but also the ethical implications, because you can't really give proper advice. You can't really understand the landscape without putting yourself in the shoes of the ultimate person that's affected by the technology that's being rolled out. And so I think that's the passion that you hear is I love the internet, right? I am of that generation that absolutely enjoys the perks of the internet. And so and I love technology. So why would I not want to know more about it and to understand how it can help and how we should regulate it as well?
That's phenomenal. Thank you for that background. Now, I didn't know and I'm glad you brought this up about your experience working in Singapore and Asia Pacific. And I agree. I'm sort of plugged into a lot of folks in those areas of Singapore and Philippines, and
Mm.
I feel like a lot of times when we're talking about data privacy and data protection, a lot of times it's kind of a lot of talk about US and Europe, right? And there isn't enough talk about what's happening kind of in Asia Pac. And it has Asia Pac has very deep roots in data protection, very mature laws there. Tell me what's happening in that region that you think that our listeners need to know about if they've only been thinking about Europe and the US.
Yeah, look, the most important thing is to recognize that the GDPR isn't exactly the highest standard in the world, right? In Asia Pacific, for example, consent is the only viable legal basis for processing, unlike in Europe, where you can use, in a lot of cases, legitimate interests to process. Obviously, variations across Asia Pacific. So consent's a pretty high bar, and that's like the go-to mechanism in a lot of countries in Asia Pacific. And then the challenge is, unlike the EU, where you have a standardized piece of legislation, is every single country has a different political landscape. And so that political landscape informs how the legislation around personal data and privacy would go. And so, I think teams out in Asia Pacific are so understaffed because you're looking at maybe 14 different laws and one or two people taking care of the region. I mean, I started out my career and I was the only person for 2 years, 2.5 years doing the job of covering so many different countries. And then you're also seeing, some countries have data localization in place. So if you are active in the Chinese market, you're going to have to take into account some of the new changes, the new laws, the new SECs, the data transfer requirements out there. It's a lot of privacy work out there that needs to be done. And so if you are active in those markets, you really need to sort of stop looking at it as like, oh, I need to be concerned about GDPR. I only need to be concerned about what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere in the West. Like there's so much happening in Asia Pacific that requires a much more detailed look into all of the little things that could trip you up, right? In terms of, even things like registering with a regulator, your systems and your not just your data breaches. So there's a lot of these things that people need to be aware of when you talk about doing a global privacy program.
Yeah, that I agree. You touch on a really important point that I think a lot of people don't really understand. So people are very the GDPR popularized this idea of a legitimate interest, right? With kind of six different ones. And for GDPR, consent is like the kind of the lowest one, right? So they want you to use these other ones first before you get to consent, where you have some countries where either consent is the top, right? It's like the most favorable way, or like you say, certain APAC countries, it really is the only way to be able to get stuff. So I think that is something that people really need to be aware of. I found that, like, for example, when I advise people on stuff that's happening in the UAE, they're shocked because they're thinking, oh, we use legitimate interests. Like, no, it doesn't work that way. So I think understanding these different regions and understanding, people like you who have that different perspective of different regions and what's happening is very important. Let's talk a little bit about standard contract clauses. So I don't know. I feel like, so I've been doing standard contract clauses as long as there have been standard contract clauses. And it was work that people didn't want to do, right? Because it was kind of boring, people thought. But since we start having, stuff about shrimps and different things, I think that standard contract clauses have gotten a lot more visibility. And some people talk about it as if it just is a new thing, and it isn't. So talk to me a little bit about just navigating standard contract clauses, just in general, or at least talking to people about it, because it's like, what, we have to explain what we're going to do with data? Like, we never had to do that before. So
Yeah, and look, like you're right. Standard contractual clauses have existed for a long time for Europe, and you're seeing other jurisdictions coming up too and saying, no, you also need to have these standard contractual clauses in place and explain what you're doing with the data with the client. And it's really accountability, because if you don't know as a data controller or data user what your vendor is doing with your data, and you don't agree on fundamental basics when it comes to where data is being processed, what systems are you using, or what other vendors or sub-processor you're using, can you really be accountable for what's actually happening? Can you say you've done your due diligence? So I think it's a way for regulators to assist you almost, and like, this is how you do it, right? This is how you get some sort of assurance through your contracts that this is what's happening, and both parties are agreeing to that. And there's no room to negotiate these standard contractual clauses, because they are what they are, right? But you say that, and then I've seen where the counterparty says, "Oh no, I don't want that clause in
right,
there," and
yeah,
realizing it's the law, my friend, and it's not like something we've decided to draft on like our other clauses in the
right,
contract.
yeah.
And look, like I think with the Schrems example, obviously SECs got brought up because of the short turnaround time in order to get the new SECs in. But I think the harder part was around the data transfer impact assessments that we had to conduct, because you have, Europe saying, okay, you can transfer only if you meet certain, thresholds when it comes to security and confidentiality and that sort of thing. But you had to risk rank the countries, like what is the risk of these particular countries, because they can't make that political decision. But somehow you're expected as an organization, based on what you know in this country or what lawyers in this country know about law and enforcement, and then say, well, okay, that's high risk or that's medium risk. And I just found that whole process to be incredibly challenging. And I do welcome actually India saying that they'll have a list of countries. I just read that. That's a bold political stance to take, but it is so helpful for in-house practitioners like us, right? Because then we don't have to come up with our own determination for then maybe down the line the regulator saying, oh, actually that's high risk. I don't know why you said medium risk to that. Um, I think there's a little bit of that when it came to the Schrems 2 process. That was really really a challenging year and a half when that happened, and it coincided with me getting married as well. The dates of when you had to have your new SECs in place, and I was like, great. So I was working all the way up till I think 3 days before my actual wedding because of Max Schrems. Thanks. If Max Schrems is listening to this, thank you.
Oh my goodness. Oh, that's a good story. Let's talk a little bit about transparency. So I think the culture shock that some businesses have with data privacy and data protection is that these laws or regulations are trying to bring in an unprecedented level of transparency that was never mandated or asked for before, right? So companies would take data and they would do whatever, and then as long as they provided a service to the person, they never had to say how they were handling data, or they never had to reveal who their third parties were. So tell me a little bit about that kind of business culture shock around adjusting to all these different requirements for transparency.
Yeah, I think, you know, I think the whole point of transparency is so that the user understands what's happening with their data. But we've come to a point in history, I think, that it's now almost hidden in very long legal text, which is the privacy notice, right? We try to put everything in there, and it's not like out of bad faith or anything. It's done in good faith of trying to comply with the law. But then I think we're overcomplicating it now because we're putting in every single in case maybe scenario into these transparency requirements that, is this really something that goes to the spirit of the law in terms of transparency for individuals? And I think companies are doing that in good faith, but also trying to figure out, okay, where can we not do that as well, right? What can we say? How do we pay a bunch of lawyers to say the most non-invasive thing about how we process personal data as well? And so I think we need to make transparency a much more simpler process, a simpler way for people to access their data, and to understand what happens with their data. Because I think people are now at that point where it's not, they're agreeing to everything not because they trust everyone, they just feel like they don't have a choice anymore. And that's really sad, right? Because you want people to be able to have some sort of understanding and some sort of choice when it comes to what happens to their personal data. And that's not really what's happening right now today with transparency. But I like the fact that we have, privacy advocates out there that are going through privacy notices and finding out, okay, for high risk applications out there, or high risk systems that everyone's using, like Facebook or the use of AI, etc. Like you have now privacy advocacy groups that are helping individuals out, just like consumer protection advocacy groups. And I think that's where, if we get to a point where there's more of this work being done, then potentially we might come to a point where transparency now does benefit the end individual. They do understand what's happening when they want to understand. Like half the time, we do know people don't really want to know too much about it unless they've been wronged somehow.
Yeah. Very good. So I want you to travel with me onto the philosophical plane. Okay.
Okay.
I used to think the end all be all for privacy in terms of individual will be agency. So it'd be control of your data and stuff like that. But in the technological age that we're entering in now, there is beyond exponential growth of data, right? So we're entering into an age where almost everything that you could possibly imagine about us is being recorded and collected and collated or whatever. And I feel like agency isn't enough, because even if, let's say you had agency, if someone gave you control of all your data, what would
Yeah.
you as an individual be able to do with all that? Like, I'll give you an example. So let's say someone was on Facebook and they request all their Facebook information. Like, what would they do with all that information? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if, although we all will want to be able to see people go, or go to the point where they have control of their data or agency. But I think part of agency needs to be, what can you as a human do with this information? I don't know, maybe AI solves that problem for us. But I don't know, I'm just kind of just riffing at this point. What are your thoughts?
No, I like this philosophical train of thought, and I think it ties into what I said earlier of like, okay, well, like I kind of know what's happening with my data. I kind of have a choice, but what does this choice mean to me, and how do I do something meaningful with my choices? And that's, I think, that educational piece that we're missing, right? With people, I think, and consumer protection has been really good at this, right? Like they've had a massive PR campaign, and people now have an understanding of what they can do as a consumer. But when it comes to their own personal data, it's a little bit like, okay, so if I get you right, if I get all of this information, if I ask Facebook to stop, what happens next? Like, they probably don't know that there's still going to be data that's being stored by Facebook, for example, in different places, and might be used on like a metadata perspective. Do people actually know that? They probably don't. And I find actually what's interesting is people go, oh, I'm just a statistic or an aggregated result, but they don't realize how that's going to come back and affect them after it's been aggregated, right? Like, oh, so now I'm being I'm in this bucket, and when you put me in this bucket, that's going to affect me a different way as well. People think I just think like there's a lack of education, and I think that's on purpose when it comes to companies that collect personal information for this sort of purpose, right? Of like building a whole profile and making their entire livelihood from this particular type of model. And we're seeing obviously more and more of that sort of stuff popping up. The world of data brokers is a scary one, when you see how much they can collect about you and how much they keep about you. And that's a really scary world. But yeah, I mean, look, agency is super important. What do you do about it? Um, I think we need to be able to say at least someone's got the choice, but they need to have an informed choice is that next step. You can give people all of the choices in the world, but if they're not informed of what it actually means, it's meaningless, I think, philosophically.
I agree with that. Yeah, we'll have more deep thoughts about that in the future. I just love to ponder that idea.
Yeah.
So I want to talk a little bit about the panel we did together at PrivSec, where we talked about data privacy and AI. You had a lot of great ideas. But what concerns you right now with AI and data privacy?
I think what concerns me right now is it's a lot, to be honest. It's like a big laundry list when it comes to AI. And I think when you look at if you distill it down to certain principles, it's is it even accurate? In terms of the results, like putting privacy aside, just in general, from a general liability thing, is can you trust that the information or the end product that you're getting from an AI system is correct, is dependable? I don't think we're actually there yet. And I don't think any of, the generative AI vendors will put up their hands and say, nope, it's 100%, you can trust it. I think that worries me. And then two, I think the other thing that worries me is the lack of understanding or education around what AI is supposed to be and is supposed to do. I think we're hearing a lot of, business leaders going, "Oh, this is going to change things forever," and we're going to see changes in labor and the labor market because of AI. But like, are we actually there? Do you actually understand what generative AI is currently doing and where we're at with the sort of technology? That worries me too. And then third is the issue we talked about, which is the legality of the data that's being used for modeling the AI technology itself. Obviously, there's a lot of issues around IP and terms and conditions of websites, and there's no clear clarification on that, right? And that really does worry me about using generative AI products, because so far, and correct me if I'm wrong, we haven't heard any sort of statements from the providers saying, no, our product's fine. We've got all the permissions, we've got everything that's required, it's all good, and we've tested for bias.
Wow. Yeah, that's true. That's true. So when we're talking about this, I think the next thing I want to talk about is consent. So consent is tricky, and this is kind of how I think a lot of these companies are getting around some of the other more kind of tangled legal issues, because when you consent to something, there's almost no ceiling to what consent could be, right? So like
Yeah.
you can't legally sell your limbs, but that's about it. So you can consent to almost anything, right? So when you're in these AI models, I think that they are trying to rely on consent, and we know that consent is very asymmetrical. But I don't think we don't even understand the level of asymmetry there could be in an AI system. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. I think even without AI, there's an asymmetry of power when it comes to consent in general. Like we know that if you want to use a service and they make you consent to things, then unfortunately, like, people don't really have that symmetry of power to say, no, I don't want to do that. But then you put AI into it, and there's this whole problem with explainability. of the model and what it could potentially do with your data. And people go back again to the educational page about AI is, do people know what they shouldn't be putting into the model, what they shouldn't be inputting into ChatGPT or Bard? I don't think so, right? Because that's and that's the legal disclaimer for a lot of these products is, oh, make sure you're not doing this, but it's embedded somewhere else, not at the point in which like you're putting your information through, as far as I understand it, at least. Um, and so this asymmetry of information now, so it's no longer asymmetry of power, but asymmetry of information and understanding of what happens to your information, um, is what I'm concerned about, when it comes to these products being pushed out. And I think, people who are using, like your layperson that's using ChatGPT or Bard or Lensa AI, which was that art one, I don't think they actually know that when you put in your image, like it's there now, it's theirs, right? Or that a lot of the art that is being produced is scraped from other artists who have not consented for Lens AI to have access to this. Um, they're not earning a single cent from Lens AI. And so I feel like this asymmetry of information is being hidden behind, look at this cool thing that it can do. Look at this cool picture of you. Look at this cool responses that I can get from ChatGPT. Look at how cool it can draft my stuff. And it really goes back into the principles of ethics. And I don't know if you read, but I think this week, if not last week, Microsoft's fired its data ethics department.
Yeah, I saw
I
that.
mean, yeah, and so that's a little concerning.
Yeah.
Just as a punter, as a layperson, just
Yeah.
looking at that.
Right. Yes,
Yeah,
yes. I agree. I agree with that. I think we as women of color in privacy, we have a special relationship with how
yeah,
bias plays out, because
exactly.
we've been the victims of that. And so understanding that, or understanding why that's important, I think is a great discussion to have. So give me your thoughts about bias and how that plays into privacy issues.
Yeah, so I mean, first of all, is whether the data model has been sufficiently trained on a wide variety of people, their responses, their backgrounds. Because if it's not, we both know it's just not going to work, right? There's been, a couple years now, there's a female Black researcher who's been doing work around facial recognition that doesn't recognize people of color. That's a major thing. And then I've also asked Microsoft about they're rolling out the whole Copilot application that will transcribe notes from Microsoft Teams. Now, have you trained your model to recognize different accents? Because you don't want to have that situation where someone is speaking English, but the model can't detect it because it's a different accent. It's like when you watch a TV show and someone's speaking English, it's different accent and there's subtitles. It just demeans the person's ability to connect with other people just because they have a different accent. And then, I think we talked about this on the panel as well, is in recruitment systems of how the use of language, the demographics of your job application, where you went to school, even if you strip out all of these things, if you've done certain types of jobs and you've described it a certain way, that could be ascribed to your ethnicity or your socioeconomic background. And that could lead to your ethnicity again, because certain areas or certain types of jobs are done by people of a certain gender or certain ethnicity in different countries. And so I think so much thought needs to go into bias and removing bias in the system. And I think there was the regulators have thought about that, of potentially introducing sensitive information to minimize bias. But who's the expert here, right? I think that's what I find interesting is the expert the data scientist that's supposed to know? because I don't think that's who it is. It has to be someone who understands socio-economic situations in different countries. It's almost like an anthropology study here of someone who understands diversity and inclusion and the far-reaching aspects of this that companies need to have in their arsenal in order to say that, okay, we've tested for bias in these different ways. We've tested it in this sort of focus group and these sort of groups, and we think it's okay. And again, you can never be 100% foolproof. That's what we know. But not thinking about that, not doing a stakeholder analysis with people who are of different backgrounds, ethnicities, gender identities, you are never going to find out if your system is biased or not.
Absolutely. I mean, and then, you're building these products for humans, not just certain types of humans. So it's like
Exactly.
if you test it on a small, or you have like a very narrow group of people that are involved in kind of the making of the system, and then you try to take the system and push it out on everybody, it's just not going to work, right? And that though a lot of those bias issues can turn into really bad issues, right? Where we're seeing people being arrested, because a facial recognition system misidentified them, or we're seeing children being put out of school because maybe they're doing like school from home, and the algorithms are not picking up, like maybe their background isn't lit the right way or something, and they're like, oh, well, that person isn't like in the class, and they're like, well, here I am right here, right? So I mean, thinking about the harm that can happen to people, and thinking about maybe groups that are either underrepresented in the making of these systems, and also people who may be marginalized, that need to be on the internet, need to be able to do things in digital systems that don't harm them.
Yeah, 100%. Like, and because if I'm so glad you brought up the fact of marginalized societies, because these are the people who most likely would not have access to data literacy or technology literacy, right? And they wouldn't know how to maneuver to make sure that the bias doesn't affect them. And those are the people that, when you're developing any sort of AI that's going to affect people at the end of the day, needs to take into account. And I think that's so key. I mean, we know that just traditional science has had women in the backseat for a long time, in the field of medical science as well. Different bodies, different ethnicities it has taken a backseat, and we're only starting to analyze actually, certain markers, certain genetic markers are different. It's not a white person's liver is not going to look like a brown person's liver, for example, but we only can detect cancer in a white person's liver sometimes because that's the years of research of that we have right now. I think that there was a really great John Oliver episode on AI that I watched, and it was actually the day before our panel. And he said something really interesting because they trained an AI model to look at photos of moles or different type of skin conditions to detect whether there was cancer. And what it detected was, if there was a ruler in the photo, then there would be cancer, because all of these photos would have a photo of a ruler to measure how big the mole is, or how big the skin condition is. And so we're not even there yet to like figure out the data input for basic things like that, let alone ethnic bias or gender bias or sexuality bias in these systems. I think, the example I gave as well during our panel was how a self-driving car hit a person because it didn't detect a person who's jaywalking, because that wasn't part of their data input. A person is always walking on a crosswalk or a zebra crossing. So yeah, if those things can happen and those have nothing to do with the kind of people they are, like imagine the kind of bias that could happen when it comes to, or negative impacts when it comes to gender and ethnicity and sexuality.
There was a medical study done where AI was analyzing X-rays of people, and they could tell. They said the AI was able to tell the race of the person without them telling it. I don't know how that's possible, right? But that is a huge bias issue. That's a huge privacy issue as well, right? Because
Yeah.
you're bringing in sensitive data categories into AI systems that could possibly create like discrimination or harm to those
Yeah.
systems. So maybe let's say the tech says, well, the African American group, they're not going to get the cancer treatment, but these other people will because that's what the data set says. You know what I'm
Yeah.
saying? So
Yeah.
pulling those markers out is very important. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. I think, trying to figure out this comes down to the explainability of the AI model, right? Like, why has it made that decision? Because if you can't, if you have a black box AI that who knows what it's doing and why it's come up with its conclusion, as exciting as the possibility of technological advancement on that, if it impacts people and you can't explain why, you just can't fix it, right? And definitely I think first principles, right? Computers don't create information right now. They're just regurgitating information that exists in a much faster way. Like if our brains were that fast, we'd be able to do the same thing. um and so if we're feeding it information that's already biased, it's not going to come up with anything but biased information. And the medical field is such a great one, such a great example, because it is biased today. We know things like a BMI measurement, for example, is completely off because it's based on a certain group of people. It's not supposed to be something that affects everyone, that BMI scale. And yet, doctors today still will do your health test and say, your BMI is high. Like I always get a BMI obese, because it doesn't take into account the kind of my ethnicity and how I'm built. It just is this random standard that people came up with years ago, and they're still using that today. So imagine if you put in BMI information into an AI model, and it will just tell everyone without any further information, yep, you're unhealthy, you're unhealthy, you're unhealthy, without actually going to the details of why it's come up with that. So until the source data gets cleared up in the medical field, I can't see how AI can help in these situations. You're absolutely right.
Yeah. I see AI tools that are being built now. I see them more as something that could help more low stakes. I have a problem with using these AI systems in high stakes situations, especially if they're leading to decisions or people are abdicating their human judgment to an AI system, right? Because we have to be able to look at those blind spots to make sure that the things that we're putting in there or the decisions that we're making aren't harming or excluding people.
Absolutely. I think the low stakes is where it's at right now. But in saying that, I think there's this misconception that if you're like a manual data entry and sort of like a low skilled worker, you're going to lose your job to AI. I actually think that's not the case right now. I think it's actually that second tier. We had a demo of Copilot, and I was like, this will only work if we have proper data management in place, and proper data inputs in place. Data input is still a big thing, but what it takes away is that layer of people making nice slides, or people assisting with making these sort of like client facing documentation. That's the layer I think that's going to be affected if they don't know how to use the technology that's coming up. And I think if the pandemic taught us anything, is these low skilled workers, and on the podcast it's all inverted commas, are people we rely on the most in society. Like we can't replace them by sitting in your living room on your computer. That's just not the reality we live in right now.
That's true. I agree with that. I want to to talk with you a little bit about the UK. You're in the UK right now.
Yes, I am.
I feel like the UK is in a very interesting position. So this is after Brexit. You're not part of the EU anymore, but you're connected to the EU. You have a strong relationship with the US, and it's like the US and Europe are different, right? Based on data
Hmm.
protection. And so the EU, you all had the UK has these new proposals about how they want to change things. So just give me an idea what's happening in your world in the United Kingdom
Yeah.
with data privacy.
So my caveat is, as much as I'm based in the UK, I monitor more of a global standard than I do the UK. But I spoke at the IPP UK DPI 2 weeks ago, and John Edwards, the Information Commissioner, had a speech, and it came out before the announcement of the new bill and what was going to be in the new bill. And I think you're going to see the ICO trying to hold on to its values that it's had for a long time when it comes to data protection, which is very much informed by the GDPR. And that's still going to be there. But I think how this is going to affect businesses is um, if you're a local UK business, everything that's coming out is like, plus points, plus points. It's easier, for example, from your records of processing activities. But if you're a global organization, this is where you're going to start struggling with adequacy of having data being transferred to the UK. We don't know how long this is going to last if this is the position that the UK is going to take. Now, will the EU think the UK is as dangerous as the US? Probably not. But trying to get adequacy is going to be such a challenge, with what's being proposed right now. There are fundamental principles that still adhere to GDPR, but I think most organizations are probably still going to try to keep the GDPR set. You've already started it. Why would you roll back to a less compliant, or I guess less compliant might not be the right word, more of a lower risk position from the work that you've already done. So it's interesting times for sure with the UK regulations, because they've also taken a different position when it comes to AI regulations. And so it remains to be seen of what the final product's going to look like. But it's the UK's position, I think, is that it's more about commerce now. It's more about engendering business. The economy is not great. So it's going to be all about that, making sure that it's more of a destination for technology, for development, economic development, than it is like a barrier that maybe the advantage that they have with this over the EU when it comes to investing into technological structures.
Yeah. I think a lot of people are taking a wait and see stance to it. I mean, because nothing's changed yet. It's basically proposals and things have to work their way through, the political systems and stuff like that. And I advise my UK clients, I'm like, just sit tight right now. It's really nothing to do at this moment. We have to see how this kind of plays out. But it was kind of a nail biter over here in the US for us around kind of adequacy between the UK and the EU. Because I was like, oh my God, is it going to happen? Is it not going to happen? And we were so excited that it did happen, because it could be, it just creates more complication for people who have to manage a lot of these different areas. So I'm hoping to see more, even if we don't have laws that are the same, at least we can have some principles that we can kind of agree on.
Absolutely. And, hate to bring it back to the AI discussion. I think that's what we're seeing in AI regulation. More so is the principles are all tying up to each other in the different countries that have AI regulation. So um, maybe that will be an easier landscape to maneuver once all the laws are in place compared to the privacy landscape that potentially is a little bit more thorny because it's had a lot of time to develop in different countries and attachments to the political system as well.
Yeah, I agree. So if it were the world, according to you, Tarishna, what would be your wish for privacy anywhere in the world? So whether that would be regulation, law, technology, human stuff, human behavior. What are your thoughts?
Um, that's a big one. I have such a long list, but I'm gonna tell you what I think the regulation should have is that every single company in the world needs to put data ethics into its core belief system, because I think we're focusing too much on privacy or security or competition law. But if you have data ethics in place, I think everything flows down from that, because it's you care about what happens to the end individual. You care about how the data that you're collecting or using affects the individual, more so than just following potentially a tick box exercise that privacy might be. I think privacy can become a bit of like, okay, you can do it if you tick these boxes and you've done these things. But the should you do it is very hard to legislate. And not enough corporations are asking themselves that question of should you do it if you can do it. And that would be my big wish is data ethics becomes the core and the founding principles for every company moving forward.
That's a good wish. I like that. I think what a lot of companies are doing, or some companies are doing, they just feel like, well, let's just do the bare minimum. Let's, comply with regulation, and that's fine, right? But you're not going to get like a gold star or a lollipop because we didn't break the law. Woo, people aren't going to be impressed by that, but they will be impressed by what's your stance on the human's right to their data or how transparent you're going to be. So I think that there's an opportunity for businesses to be able to step out and gain that trust, but then also, ethics aren't laws, right? And not all laws are ethical. So being able to have ethics to be part of kind of the DNA of organizations, I think is the way forward.
Absolutely, absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head. It's that not all laws are ethical. You know, it's sometimes made by lawmakers that have political agendas. We know that. So that's the laws don't exist because they've been dropped down by the gods of data ethics, is it? Or ethics in general. So
That's right.
yeah.
We agree on that 100%. Thank you so much for being on the show. This was tremendous, and I know that the audience will like it as much as I did.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a really good conversation. I've really enjoyed myself. We don't get to talk like this a lot.
No.
And I'm happy to share my thoughts. Thank you so much for inviting me on this.
Oh, I really appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
Absolutely.